Well, good evening. I have been looking forward to this for quite some time. I don't know exactly how long it has been since Josh contacted me about this opportunity, but I always look forward to the time that I get to spend with the University Church of Christ. Have a long association with this congregation, even longer association with many of those of you who are members here at this congregation. John and Judy Sheehan were among our first friends when Wanda and I first married and moved to the Tampa area, and even beyond that, I have association with Buddy and Sharon Clark even before the time that we came to Tampa together. Buddy and I, in fact, went to high school together, and of course, Buddy was, one of the popular kids. I was one of the nerdy kids, but, we have kind of converged on one another in these latter days here. And of course, have a long association with so many of you. I should not have started mentioning names. Time would fail me. Speak about our long association to work at Florida College with Andersons, about the time that we spent with Pattons. Our children kind of grew up together, especially our daughters. But I am so excited to be with you and to have this opportunity to share with you a lesson that will strengthen, I hope, our faith in the Creator. And I have chosen to title this lesson, In His Image. There are many, of course, avenues by which we might approach the topic of evidences, many kinds of evidences we might look at, the internal evidences of the Scripture, the evidences of the life of Jesus, the archaeological evidence. But for me, one of the strongest evidences of creation, of a creator, is man himself. When we read in the Scriptures, as in Genesis 1 and verse 26, that God said, "Let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the seas and the birds of the heavens and the livestock and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. And when we look at one another, we have some inkling of that which is the characteristic of God who created us in His own image. What exactly that is, we will look at a little further as we move through the lesson. There really are two great systems of thought that stand opposed to one another in the 21st century. Two great systems that attempt to explain the most important things in our life. That is naturalism and theism. Naturalism, the presumption that what we see is all that there is. Perhaps we might call that materialism, that which you can touch and handle, the tangible things, those are the real things. On the other hand, there is theism, the concept that there is a God, a personal God who has created the world, and all the things that are in the world belong to Him and operate according to His rules. And when we think about those two systems, they clearly are opposed to one another, and they attempt to explain the world that we see around about us and have enormous implications for our understanding of ourselves and what our responsibilities are, both to the world and to one another. Now, you may suggest that maybe there are other systems of explanation for the world. Maybe perhaps you've heard of animism, of polytheism, or maybe even some of the New Age religions. You may, in fact, encounter people who profess in some way to believe in those systems, but I doubt that they could tell you what those systems really are, and they certainly would not be able to find a considerable corpus of material written from those perspectives to explain the world. Not the way that you find with naturalism and theism. So these two stand opposed to one another. And as we think about that, you look at maybe the passage, 2 Peter chapter 3, where Peter talks about the scoffers who will come in the last days, and they're scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, "Where is the promise of His coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation." At least these guys acknowledge that there was a creation, a starting point, but their presumption is everything continues in exactly the same way according to the same rules that it always has, and presumption is it always will continue to operate this way. There is a sense in which that's exactly the statement of naturalism or materialism in the world today. At least these guys, they acknowledge the fact that there was a creation, a beginning point. The physicists, the cosmologists, of course, now have had to acknowledge that there is a beginning point, which was kind of amusingly ridiculed by calling it the Big Bang, but now everybody accepts, at least the naturalists accept, yeah, it had to have some kind of beginning point and we can trace it back. And then, of course, they try and suggest maybe, it didn't really begin. It'll just bounce back and forth between that point of singularity, of nothingness, into the world in which we exist today. These same kind of rules are going to persist. We do not believe that's the case. As theists, we understand, in fact, what Paul says in Colossians 1 and verse 18. By him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, and all of these things have been created through him and for him. And however long the world lasts, it lasts according to the purposes that God has put into place, and it is moving towards some culmination of history that God the Father has in mind. It is a purposeful universe, not a meaningless universe that continues to operate in the same way it always has. And as a result of that, we are, like Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 18, placing our emphasis on the things that are invisible, because the things that are seen, the material things, are temporary, but the things which are not seen, the things of the Spirit, are those things which are eternal, because it was the Spirit God who gave rise to these material, visible things that we see around us today. The naturalists, of course, when we have a debate with them, are not going to accept any kind of revelation from Scripture. They are not going to accept the fact of internal evidences of the Scriptures. That is not something that fits into their system. And in fact, when we argue with those naturalists, I think the best argument that we can make is man himself. The fundamental argument is like this. Naturalism demands that there is a natural cause in the nature of everything in the world. That there should be a way by which we could say if these forces are colliding here, that they began here and they interacted with this according to these rules, and we should be able to trace that back all the way to forever, because there's this natural consequence of things. And if that's the case with naturalism, as they presume that's the case, then if we can find one thing in nature that cannot be explained as continuous with nature, then naturalism is inadequate as an explanation for those things. And my argument tonight would be that if there is one thing in nature that is discontinuous with nature, it is man himself. When we look at man, we recognize that in some ways he is a part of the natural things around about us, made of the dust of the earth as he was, but that he is different because God breathed into him and made him a living spirit in his own image. And a close examination of that which is unique about mankind will tell us that these things are not continuous with the rest of nature. Man himself is the best evidence of a creator God when we look at him and we recognize that he has the capacity of cognition or reason, when he has the capacity of communication or language, when he has consciousness, sentience, as the word has become popular in the last few years. Man is the best evidence of creation. You look at people, and people are absolutely amazing. The psalmist in Psalm 8 and verse 3 looks at the amazing universe around him. And of course, some of you have had the experience of being out away from the ambient light of the big cities, out away from the smog that obscures the heavens and the starry nights when you're out camping, and you look up and you're amazed at the heavens that God has created. And the psalmist looks at all of that and he says, when I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars which you set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him, but you've made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor, and you've given him dominion over the works of your hand, and you put all things under his feet. Sometimes we use that verse to minimize or dismiss man, to talk about man's shortcomings. That's not what that passage is about. That passage is suggesting when you look at the amazing universe that God's created, it's absolutely amazing that man is the crown of creation and that God has put him in charge of all of these things around about us. You should be amazed when you look at man, when you look at human beings. And of course, the evolutionists are going to want to suggest that there's a continuity between nature, between the animals, the other created living things, and man. And they'll want to say that we share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. And of course, I don't really care what the percentage is. Look at a wolf and a mouse, and they share 90% of DNA together, and still there's a pretty significant difference between a wolf and a mouse. And in fact, when they talk about the DNA, as they're only talking about the things that they know to count these days, they've discovered now there's all this kind of junk DNA, as they call it, that they've not been paying attention to. And we know further that it's not the genes that make the difference in the creature, but it is the timing by which they turn on and turn off. And it's not surprising to me that they can find those similarities, because we are created out of the dust. And even if it is only 98% similarity between us and chimpanzees in terms of DNA, 2% makes a pretty significant difference. You take a glass of water here and another glass of water there, and you put 1% E. coli in this one and not in that one. That's only a 1% difference, but it will make the difference of life and death for those who choose to assert that they are similar. Or you could say washing machines and cars share 98% of the same material, so they obviously must be essentially the same. That's clearly not the case. And if we wanted to measure it on the elemental level, people, washing machines, and mice all share the same basic elements that comprise this earth. No, that's not really what we're concerned about. What we're concerned about is that God created us in His own image when He created us. You look at the person next to you. Look at the people around here. Look at the folks that you have just talked to this evening. And there are considerable similarities between all of us, and considerable differences too, just in the appearance between us. But there are also considerable differences, though considerable similarities, in our personalities, in the things that we like, in the things that we think about, in the way in which we talk. These differences are important to us, but the similarity is important to us too. And you think about this, what does it mean that God created us in His image? When you look at the person next to you, in some ways, you have an inkling about the nature of God. And hopefully, of course, when they look at you, they have some idea about the nature of God. What exactly is it that is characteristic of human beings that is in the image of God? Considerable amount of ink has been used to try and discuss that question, but I would suggest these three topics really go on anybody's list: cognition, consciousness, and communication. Those things are characteristics of human beings that are not characteristic of any of the other of the creatures. that God has made and placed here on the earth. There's a discontinuity between man and animals, and the discontinuity is graphically displayed when we think about man's ability to reason, his ability to communicate, and his understanding of himself. Now, I will admit this argument is not going to sway any of the naturalists that I know. I've spoken with some about that. And they will dispute perhaps the significance of the differences that I want to emphasize tonight. And they will attempt to find some kind of continuity with our reason that goes back into nature itself. But for me, the best evidence of a creator is exactly these kind of characteristics that we look at in man, and common sense tells you is not something that's characteristic of the rest of the creatures. First of all, cognition. Job 38 and verse 36, and of course you know by that time in Job, God's listened to all the arguments, the debate, the back and forth, the logic. Have y'all studied Job recently? I mean, it's kind of like boring sometimes, but maybe it's not really boring when you look and see what exactly arguments are they making, what are the assumptions they're using, how are they refuting one another or debating with Job. Nonetheless, they've spent a long time arguing, reasoning, and then God speaks and God says, well, actually this is before God speaks, but Job 38 and verse 36, who has put wisdom in the mind? Who's given understanding to the heart? How is it, in fact, possible that we're able to have that kind of discussion? Some of you perhaps have studied the book of Job and you've been disappointed. I wanted there to be an answer when I read the book of Job. I first read it and it's like, oh, this is not fair, but there's a bunch of chapters left and we're going to figure out before the end of it why these things happened to Job. And then I got to the end and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know any more than I did before. But the very fact that we read that book and we understand there wasn't an answer, and that we understand that we're disappointed that there wasn't an answer, means that we have a capacity to reason about that. That's amazing. Where did that come from? When I do this class for the students or for younger students, I start with this: tell me a riddle. And of course, that's always dangerous, and we probably won't do that here. And of course, sometimes we get lost in the details, especially with the young kids. They remember vaguely a riddle, but they can't quite get all the details right. Or sometimes what I really wanted was, the dad kind of joke sort of things. You know, which animal should you never play games with? A cheetah. So, and it doesn't matter whether it's a good riddle or not. In fact, bad riddles work better because we hear it and we say, aha, I could see you thought that was going to be funny because you saw this connection with it, but I can see it's not really funny because that's not a sufficiently powerful enough connection to make it funny. We have the capacity to reason. That's what we call cognition. We understand, we remember, we think about things. Ephesians 3 and verse 4. How Paul writes in the letter to the Ephesians about the way in which he wants to communicate with them. And he says that he'd written to them how the mystery was made known to be by revelation, as I wrote to you briefly. When you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mysteries of Christ. And of course, sometimes we read that, and we do. We perceive the insights that he had, and we feel that sense of satisfaction. And then other times, we read it and we're puzzled, and we're like, it didn't really quite tell me what I wanted it to tell me, but we are thinking about that. Thinking has been defined as just maybe some kind of mental manipulation. I can take this and I can take this and I can put it together and that's what it looks like. I can take this strange object and I can imagine it spun around in space and I can see what it looks like from the backside. We could probably figure out, if we wanted to, what this building would look like if instead of facing this way, we had the pulpit down there and the pews all spread out down this way. We could do that by rearranging physically all of these pews, but we don't have to do that. You can see that right away. That's the reason we do it this way. That's the reason the chairs, the pews are slanted as opposed to going all the way from one end to the other. We can think about those things. We can mentally manipulate that. And we can create computers that can do that very well. They can manipulate information, they can move it around, but when they do so, they only follow the algorithms that some man programmed in them in the first place. They only do what we programmed them to do. But children, on the other hand, children, you can't stop them from thinking. That's a problem, really. When we had our first children, I thought the tough thing is going to be, teaching them how to think. Tough thing is going to be getting them to learn things. And then I figured out pretty quickly, the really bad thing about kids is they learn things real fast. You make a mistake one time, they're going to remember it. And they're going to use it against you probably in the future. They learn and they think all the time. Any of you here ever been accused, or maybe accused somebody else, you think too much? That's a problem for people. We can't stop thinking. You go to bed at night and you can't get to sleep because you just keep thinking. Animals maybe process information. They can figure out simple kind of traps or tricks, but they do so on a very limited basis. Take a 2-year-old child and take your very smartest dog, and the 2-year-old child is going to put that dog into shame by what they can learn and what they can figure out. There's a discontinuity between nature and human beings. God has called us to reason with Him. He didn't call the chimpanzees to reason together. He didn't call the rest of nature to reason together. He says, come, let us reason together, because He created us in His image so we would have that capacity. We are unique in all of nature in our capacity to think and to reason. What does naturalism have to say about that? Most naturalists don't try to deny thought itself. Instead, they try to explain it as the basis of some kind of chemical processes, that it is just a result of the motion of electrons or the chemical reactions in the brain. To put it bluntly, what they're saying is that it's just the movement of the meat between the ears. It has no more significance than digestion, has no more significance than any of the chemical processes that take place outside of the mind. It operates according to the same chemical, physical rules. And if that's the case, then reason, from their point of view, is meaningless. It's just a result of material processes. You can't call one thought true and another thought false in that kind of a system any more than you could say this behavior is true and this behavior is false. All behavior is equally real, and all chemical reactions are equally real. When we say one thought is true and one is false, one conclusion is correct and another one is incorrect, we're doing so on the basis of some kind of understanding that is independent of, above the order of the chemical processes that are taking place. And here's the amazing thing. The naturalists are going to try and argue with you and say there can't be a God. They're going to try and argue with you and say evolution happened this way. These are the ways in which the chemical electrical processes lead to your thinking that you're thinking. And it's like, I don't really understand how you can do that, because that's contradictory. If you really believe that, you wouldn't try to convince me, because you wouldn't care one way or the other, because nothing is inherently better or worse. No one reason is inherently more logical than another one. It's all just chemical processes. As C.S. Lewis wrote in chapter 3 of Miracles, if naturalism is true, then it leaves us with no reason to believe that it is true. And before him, in a book of called Orthodoxy, Chesterton wrote, the great and possible peril is that the human intellect is free to destroy itself. And that seems to be where the naturalists are. They have reason to a point at which they have destroyed any confidence in reason. And then they wonder why those who are educated in that system despair and make really bad choices. So you choose. You choose either naturalism, which says that there is no really such thing as reason, or you choose theism, which says created in the image of God, we can reason with one another, and in fact, He created us with reason, so He could reason with us. Try this one. Communication. Come, let us reason together, God says. Not just a matter of let's think, I'll think over here, you think over there, but let's share content of our thinking, the result of our thinking. You tell me what you thought, I'll tell you what I think. Let's compare those things. Let's reason together and see who has the best conclusions, the best view of the world. Let's see who can convince the other one. That's communication. So I do this one. Describe this picture. And, it's kind of fun if you don't show the picture, have people paired up and one person cover their eyes, the other person see the picture, and then blank the picture out and have the one who saw it describe it to the one who didn't see it. And, of course, you can make it as complicated as you want. And what would people do in that case? Well, mostly they get kind of nervous and they start stammering and stuttering. And maybe, in a case like this, they'd say something like, well, it's a painting. Maybe they would be more specific, say it's a painting of a landscape, a riverbank. Maybe they would know enough to be able to say, well, it is pointillism, a particular style of painting. Some might even say it's Seurat's gray weather at the Grand Jetty. And they're trying to give the other person some idea, understanding of what they saw. And they may be more or less successful if the recipient's able to ask questions and the sender is able to answer those questions. They can get closer and closer to the point that one person can create in the mind of another a similar idea. We can create a common understanding by our speaking to one another. We can put an idea in the other person's mind. Communication is the capacity for us to give this information to other people, to be able to tell them about our insights, and then for them to see that in their mind, to share that with us, as Paul wrote in Ephesians 3 and verse 4. And of course, my argument is that's discontinuous with anything else in nature. Sometimes the arguments are made, well, we can create computers that do that, and we do talk about computers sharing or exchanging information. Probably better if we say the computers share or exchange data, because it's not really information, they're not being informed. When we pass the USB from one computer to the other, or when we use it across a cable, or we send it through the cloud, it's just a conveyance of those bits and pieces of data. It's not informing the other computer about anything. Now, we can be informed when we look at the picture, and we can inform someone else as we speak to them about that. We can share our understanding with one another. Psalm 25 and verse 4, the psalmist says, "Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths." And who among us has not, as a result of Bible classes, Bible study, sermons, maybe even some sermons, hasn't been led to understand something more about what God wants us to do? We're able to communicate in that way. We can create those ideas in common. And of course, animals have signaling system. They can share some kind of information on a limited basis, but they can't share understanding. They do not communicate to another creature, another animal. They do not create in the mind of that other creature. They do not create a common understanding. Now, you have your own pets, and I'm sure you love your pets, and your pets probably are able to create a common understanding in your mind. Well, they're able to create an understanding in your mind that you think is common with them, but I'm pretty sure that's not the case. My wife has cats, always have had cats. I was not much of a cat person until I got married, and it was 25, 30 years into marriage I realized You know, there have been very few years that we haven't had cats in our marriage, so I guess I'm kind of a cat person too. And you know, they lie there and they look at you. And my wife will tell me all kind of things that they have in their mind. But you know, I know what idea they have. When that cat lies near the floor looking at you, he's thinking, if I was bigger, I'd eat him. Well, there's no communication except as we make it up with our animals. And people are really great, and I know I hurt people's feelings. My dog tells me all kinds of things. My dog can communicate this, communicate that, and communicate the other. But I will tell you this, no matter how energetic your dog is, no matter how expressive you think he is, when he is barking at you and running around in circles, he's not talking about next week when we're going to go on a trip to Alaska. He's not able to displace in time and displace in distance as we are with our language. Our language is endlessly productive. Of the making of many books, there is no end, Solomon said. Drivel just pours out in this country. I have a Kindle, and you go to the Amazon Prime, and it's just free book after free book after free book. And of course, it's a reason why they're free. They're not worth anything, but people just pour them out. You could write a sentence right now that nobody has ever written before. It might not be a very good sentence, but you could do that. That's the nature of language. Animals can't share an understanding in the way that we can. Naturalism comes to grips with communication, or tries to come to grips with communication with man's language, and recognizes it has no explanation for it. Noam Chomsky, one of the founders of the cognitive revolution in psychology and one of the early psycholinguists, recognizes the impossibility of accounting for language by naturalistic evolution. It's a unique phenomena, he says. No significant analog in the animal world. No reason to suppose that the gaps between animal signaling system and human communication are bridgeable. There's no evolutionary basis for it, he says. There is no naturalistic explanation for language. And of course, there are plenty of specialists who spend their time trying to trace the evolution of one language into another, and yet they all run back eventually into the problem of Genesis chapter 11 when God confounded the language of men. Language belongs to people, and there is no kind of gradual development of language in the animals that jumps even to man. It is something entirely different in man than it is in the signaling system of animals. Yes, we're amazed and we can share that information. Well, we can't because we don't have it. At least I don't have it. But I am told that the bees have this intricate dance to explain what the kind of nectar or flowers are and which direction they are and how far you're going to have to fly, how many bees ought to go out to get it. I'm told that they can do that, but when they're communicating that, they can't talk to you about people. You can't believe people, they gather together and they sit around and they listen to one guy just talk and talk and talk about naturalism versus theism. No, there's some gap here that is too great to be bridged by evolution. Even the dogmatic Darwinist of Richard Dawkins finds it impossible to explain the clear origin of human language. My example, he says, of those kind of things is language itself. Nobody knows how it began. I am biased toward thinking it was gradual, but it's not obvious that it had to be. It's not. In fact, it's pretty obvious that it wasn't gradual. In fact, Philip Lieberman, a cognitive psychologist who specializes in the evolution of language, uses very biblical terminology when he says, "For with speech came a capacity for thought that had never existed before, and that has transformed the world. In the beginning was the Word." And of course, that biblical language resonates with us, and he should recognize that when he says that, that he is lending credibility to the theistic system of understanding the world as opposed to the naturalistic system. They would have done well to have heard God's rebuke of Moses in Exodus chapter 4 when he says, "Who has made man's mouth? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall say." And of course, in some special ways, Moses got a revelation from God that was unique and something that we don't share in. But in some ways, each and every one of us has been gifted by God with a mouth and with a language and with the ability to teach and to say. And of course, that's the point I missed on the slide earlier. That's one of the reasons it kind of amazes me that the penalty for lying is so great. Every liar will have their place in the lake of fire. And why is that the case? Because God has given us this wonderful gift of the ability to create an understanding in somebody else's mind. I can put an idea in your mind that will be as powerful in directing your behavior as anything that is true or real in the external world. And that capacity is godlike. And to betray that and to put false ideas into somebody else's head, that's reprehensible. And that's why God punishes it so much. You choose. Naturalism, which says animal signaling system gradually develops into the kind of language that we have as human beings, or the theistic point of view, we were created in the image of God, and a part of that is our capacity to communicate with one another and to create a common understanding. Of course, I understand the irony. I know some of you are thinking that right now. I keep talking about creating a common understanding, and you're like, I don't understand a word that he's saying. So I understand that. It is a capacity that we have. We don't always use it or use it effectively. But we could do that if we worked hard enough on it. Number 3, cognition, communication, and consciousness. Consciousness is another aspect of man, maybe the preeminent aspect of man that defies naturalistic explanation and which represents the image of God in which we're created. Even as we think about this topic, we are aware that we are thinking about it. We are aware that we are reasoning together. Some people are aware that they're bored. Some people are aware that this is a difficult material. Some people are aware that this is very similar to what Will Dilbeck said, 5 weeks ago. But we are aware of those things, aware of something, awareness of being aware, that we can think about that. This is consciousness. So what does this taste like? Now, of course, I chose chocolate. Everybody loves chocolate. Probably there's somebody here who despises the taste of chocolate, feels a little nauseous at thinking about the taste of chocolate because you've had some kind of bad experience with chocolate in the past, but you still have that experience, that awareness of what that's like. Cold, creamy chocolate. Well, exactly. And then people say, well, what does it taste like? Well, it doesn't taste like chicken, that's for sure, but it's like, well, I know what it tastes like. If you ever tasted it, you'd know what it tastes like. Our communication fails us at that point because we are aware of it, and it's an internal awareness. What about this? What does this taste like? How many of you can think about biting into that lemon and you can feel the jaw muscles kind of tightening up as the acid flows over your tongue? We have that awareness. What about this one? What is blue? Well, blue is 450 nanometers and 2.5 megahertz of electromagnetic radiation. That's what it is. And it bounces off of that screen and back into your eyes, and it causes certain neurons to fire rather than other neurons to fire, but that's not what we are aware of. The poets would rhapsodize over the painful awareness that we have of a blue sky, a sky so blue that when you look into it, it almost hurts. Any poets among us here? You could write a poem about that. It's an awareness that goes beyond the physical facts of these things. That's what consciousness is. And only people have consciousness. Only we have sentience. We are aware. And we are aware that we are aware. We can process information. Computers can process information. But we know that we're doing that when we're doing it. We have awareness, and computers, they have no awareness. And animals have very little awareness. We are sentient. So sentient, in fact, that we become embarrassed, self-embarrassed, self-awareness of our failings and embarrassed. Just think how painful that is. Like the young lady saying to her friends after some social faux pas, I could have died. I was so embarrassed. You know that feeling. Your dog may hang his head in fear of being scolded when he's done something that you have trained him not to do, but he's not embarrassed. And that computer that the Google programmer thought was Sentius Lamata, that's not embarrassed either. They don't have consciousness or awareness. Consciousness does not arise from the natural chemical and physical processes. It's inexplicable. And the naturalists understand that that's the case. They call it the hard problem of consciousness. Neurophysiology attempts to explain all of the cognitive processes that we engage in, but they come up against consciousness, and there at that point they finally throw up their hands and they call it the hard problem of consciousness. As David Chalmers says, materialism is a beautiful, compelling view of the world, and it can't account for consciousness. We've got to go beyond the resources of materialism to do that. The great forces of nature themselves, gravity, the weak and the strong nuclear forces, magnetism, they are not conscious, but we are conscious. We are so conscious that, in fact, Descartes uses that in his skepticism. He says, what do we know for sure? I'm going to doubt every single thing. I'm going to doubt it until it's absolutely proven to me. And he says, when I get through with it all, I think, therefore I am. I am aware of my doubting, and that gives me some confidence in my existence. That's fundamental. Even the atheist who has said in his heart there is no God has to acknowledge of his self-awareness when he does that. And there's no explanation for that in the system of naturalism. William James suggested that, one of the first psychologists, suggested that, in fact, consciousness, however small it is illegitimate in nature. And I always ponder at this point whether I should use the crude language about that or not. But suffice it to say that it is illegitimate. It just is snuck in somehow. It's like it's small. And it's like, because it's small, it's like, okay. It's like I can sneak it in. We can talk about nascent consciousness. Or we can talk about emerging consciousness. But that's as silly as a woman trying to explain away her illegitimate child by saying it started so small. No, there's a cause for that. And the cause is not in nature for consciousness. The cause of consciousness is that we're created in the image of God. And the Bible, of course, is based on this fundamental premise that men are aware. And that because we are aware, we have an ability to make choices. A further aspect of this idea of consciousness that challenges the naturalistic system is man's morality. Man's morality is not just a matter of logic. It's not just a matter of practicality. It's not just a matter of figuring out what works and what doesn't work in terms of efficiency. It's an indignation. It is like, that can't be. That just can't be. Whether it seems logical or whether it seems like it's practical, there's this sense of it's not right. Indignation. And every single naturalist I've ever met is indignant about some things in the world. They may be indignant about the Holocaust. They may be indignant about the mistreatment of women or their particularly causes that they're interested in. But they are indignant about something. They may even be indignant about the fact that I believe in a God that they think is unfair, who allows the evil things to happen in the world. And that's okay, because I say to them, that's morality. That's consciousness. Where did that come from? And that's what Paul said in Romans chapter 2, therefore you have no excuse. Every one of you passes judgment. For in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same thing. Every single human being with consciousness has this indignation, this sense that some things are absolutely wrong. And I'm amazed that naturalists can purport to say, you shouldn't do this, or you should do this. Whether I agree with what they're purporting that we should do or shouldn't do, but the fact that they can claim that people are obligated and they don't have any basis of doing that. Either there is a creator who has put into us a consciousness and awareness that can be tweaked, I admit, by the things that we experience, by the things that we learn, or things that others communicate to us. But there's a creator who's put into us a sense of indignation about things that are wrong, or there is no morality. Might makes right. That's the only other alternative that you have. So you choose. Is our awareness of the world and of our own minds an illusion? Just a pretense? Or is it something real because God created us in His own image? You choose. We are created in His image. We are the best evidence of the Creator when you look around and you see other people and their ability to reason and their ability to communicate, even when they communicate error. When you see people who are aware and conscious, that gives us some inkling about God. To me, that's the greatest evidence of all. And obviously, not going to satisfy the naturalist, but it is appealing to me and hopefully appealing to you in some ways as well. I'll leave the lesson with you and hope that it was of some value for you.